I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow. Throughout her life,
King Charles sat in his private study at Buckingham Palace on a quiet evening, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting warm light over the polished mahogany. The palace was unusually silent, with only the ticking of an antique clock echoing through the room. Charles had dismissed his staff hours earlier, seeking a moment of peace after a long day of royal duties, meetings, and public events. He was reviewing a few papers when a gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A trusted aide entered, holding a single manila envelope with a serious expression. Charles immediately sensed that this was not an ordinary piece of correspondence. The envelope had come directly from Prince William and was marked confidential. It was meant for the king's eyes only. The weight of the envelope, the careful seal of red wax, and the instructions for private delivery suggested that its contents carried great importance. Charles thanked the aide and waited until the door closed before turning the envelope over in his hands, examining the wax seal stamped with William's personal insignia. The king felt a rush of curiosity mixed with concern. What could William have discovered that was serious enough to warrant such secrecy? Slowly, with deliberate care, Charles broke the wax seal and removed the report inside. The first page bore a simple title, but Charles could feel the gravity of the words even before reading them. As he scanned the opening paragraphs, his eyes widened. The report was about Camilla, the queen consort, and her actions within the palace. Charles had expected matters relating to public engagements or internal administration, but this report was different. It detailed behavior, decisions, and patterns that had gone unnoticed even by the king himself for months. Charles read every line carefully, cross-checking dates and events in his head. The report described incidents involving household staff who had suddenly requested transfers, meetings held without his knowledge, and subtle shifts in the palace's operational structure that seemed minor individually, but when seen together, painted a troubling picture. William had clearly spent weeks compiling the report, consulting multiple staff members and verifying each claim with independent sources. The meticulous documentation suggested that there was no room for doubt or casual dismissal. Charles felt a growing sense of unease as he turned each page. He recalled past conversations with Camilla that now seemed vague or evasive. He remembered advisors who had hesitated to share information, staff who had grown unusually quiet, and events that had felt slightly off but had been dismissed as ordinary. As he continued reading, a pattern began to emerge. Camilla had been quietly positioning herself in ways that increased her influence and control within the palace, often bypassing established procedures. Small decisions about staff, finances, and public engagements had been made without proper consultation, giving her a subtle but growing authority not in line with royal protocols. The report included testimony from several palace staff members, describing the pressure they felt, the subtle intimidation, and the feeling of uncertainty that had developed as a result. Charles' heart sank. Each piece of evidence reinforced the others, leaving little room for misinterpretation. It was clear that Camilla had been slowly building her own network of influence, while the king remained unaware. By the time Charles finished reading the first section, he felt exhausted, as if he had been awake for an entire night. The palace, which had always felt familiar and ordered, suddenly seemed more complicated, more fragile. The realization hit him hard. His marriage, his partnership with Camilla, and the stability of the palace operations had all been affected without his knowledge. The king's mind raced, reviewing months of memory, connecting small dots that had seemed unimportant before. Conversations, events, and staff interactions suddenly formed a coherent, unsettling picture. The trust he had placed in Camilla, and in the smooth running of palace life, now felt compromised. Charles understood that the quiet peace of his reign had been interrupted by a serious internal challenge, and that he would have to act carefully and decisively to protect both the crown and the institution. The gravity of William's report weighed on him. Not only did it reveal troubling behavior, but it also highlighted the importance of oversight, the value of experience, and the danger of blind trust, even within one's own household. Charles realized that he could no longer rely solely on appearances or past practices. The palace, its traditions, and the royal family itself depended on careful management, clear communication, and unwavering adherence to protocol. As midnight approached, Charles made a decision. He would review every claim, check the evidence personally, and then determine the steps necessary to restore proper order. The consequences of this report were enormous, not just for palace operations, but for his personal relationship with Camilla, for William, and for the future stability of the monarchy. That night, the king sat alone, aware that nothing would ever feel the same again. He had discovered a hidden truth, and it demanded a response, no matter how difficult it would be to carry out. The following days were filled with intense reflection for Charles. He began cross-referencing every incident documented in William's report against his own personal notes, diaries, and memories. Each detail aligned with his recollections in ways that were impossible to ignore. He found entries in his diary about staff members acting strangely, about meetings that seemed unusually tense, and about moments when Camilla had subtly redirected conversations or events. On their own, each observation had appeared insignificant, but taken together with William's meticulous documentation, they revealed a systematic pattern. Camilla had carefully maneuvered within the palace, influencing staff, altering procedures, and positioning herself as a central figure of authority, often bypassing Charles' knowledge or approval. The king realized that the small adjustments in daily routines, the subtle shifts in responsibilities, and the filtered flow of information were all part of a broader, calculated approach. Charles felt a mix of anger, disappointment, and sadness. He had trusted his wife implicitly, believing their partnership to be equal and based on mutual respect. Instead, he saw that she had been consolidating power quietly, methodically, and without transparency. As he reflected on the situation, he understood that confronting Camilla directly in public could cause unnecessary scandal and potentially damage the monarchy. He would have to act carefully, using strategic distance to regain control over palace operations. The king began implementing small but significant changes. He instructed his private secretary to adjust how information flowed, ensuring that all critical communications and decisions were routed directly to him. Meetings that had previously included Camilla were now scheduled with senior advisors and William, leaving her out of the process. Charles began attending key briefings alone, taking control over personnel decisions, budgets, and event planning. Each decision was deliberate, precise, and aimed at restoring proper oversight while minimizing public attention. Camilla noticed these changes almost immediately. Simple things, like the timing of car departures for engagements or the scheduling of morning briefings, were different. Charles no longer sat beside her at breakfast, instead positioning himself at the opposite end of the table. His attention focused entirely on documents. She tried to engage him in conversation, attempting to maintain normalcy, but her efforts were met with minimal acknowledgement. Charles' cold, professional distance spoke louder than any words. Slowly, the queen consort began to understand that her influence had been diminished. Staff who had previously sought her guidance now directed inquiries solely to the king. Colleagues and advisors treated her with polite formality, no longer sharing informal updates or insider knowledge. Even friends who had attended dinners or social gatherings with the couple seemed to step back, either at Charles' subtle instruction or because the environment itself had changed. Camilla attempted to adapt, maintaining a composed public appearance and fulfilling official duties with careful attention. She smiled for photographers, attended events on schedule, and performed her responsibilities as expected. Behind the scenes, however, she was increasingly isolated. She tried reaching out to William, hoping to gain insight into her sudden exclusion, but his schedule prevented a meeting. She confided in a close friend, but even that conversation offered little clarity or comfort. Camilla experienced growing anxiety, sleepless nights, and a sense of disconnection from the world she had once navigated with confidence. The physical separation within the palace, the separate wings, staggered schedules, and new communication channels amplified her sense of exclusion. The queen consort realized that her title remained intact, but her power, her influence, and her ability to participate meaningfully in palace operations had been effectively removed. Charles, on the other hand, moved with renewed focus and purpose. He coordinated closely with William and trusted advisors, ensuring that all major decisions were reviewed directly by him. By consolidating authority, he restored traditional structures and reinforced the stability of the institution. The changes were gradual enough to avoid public scandal, but significant enough to signal clearly where authority now resided. Through these actions, Charles re-established control over the palace and its operations, ensuring that the monarchy remained secure, functional, and guided by experienced oversight. Camilla, facing the reality of her diminished role, understood that confrontation would not restore her position. She chose to accept her new circumstances quietly, preserving her dignity while navigating her reduced influence. The marriage continued legally and publicly, but the partnership as it had once existed was gone. Charles had acted decisively, balancing personal feelings, loyalty to family, and responsibility to the crown. The palace staff adapted quickly, recognizing that authority rested firmly with the king. William's intervention had reshaped both family dynamics and institutional structures, creating a new reality in which Charles held central control and Camilla occupied a more ceremonial, peripheral role. The careful maintenance of appearances ensured that the public saw continuity and unity, even as behind closed doors, the internal dynamics of the royal household had fundamentally shifted. This quiet transformation of power marked the beginning of a new chapter for Buckingham Palace, one where trust, oversight, and clear responsibility took precedence over personal alliances or informal influence. For Charles, it was a painful but necessary adjustment. For Camilla, it was a lesson in the consequences of ambition and subtle maneuvering. And for William, it was a demonstration of his commitment to both family and institution, carrying the responsibility of revealing uncomfortable truths for the greater good. Over the following months, the new structure of the palace became firmly established. Charles maintained his daily routines with renewed focus, reviewing key documents personally, and coordinating with senior advisors and William for all important matters. Decisions about staffing, budgets, and events were routed directly through his office, with clear protocols and strict oversight. Camilla remained in her apartments, fulfilling public duties, attending ceremonies, and maintaining her official title, but her involvement in substantive decision-making was minimal. The staff she had previously recruited and trusted gradually moved to less influential positions, while key roles were reassigned to experienced advisors loyal to Charles and the crown. This realignment ensured that authority rested where it should, while avoiding overt disruption to palace operations. Camilla attempted to adjust to her reduced role, focusing on limited charitable work and ceremonial appearances. She learned to navigate this new existence quietly, maintaining dignity while recognizing that her previous influence had been removed. The palace environment, once familiar and cooperative, had shifted, Informal communication networks no longer included her, and her opinions on internal matters were rarely sought. Even casual interactions reflected her changed status, reinforcing the reality of her diminished position. Public appearances continued to show the couple together as required, maintaining the appearance of unity. Charles, while formally polite and courteous, kept interactions professional, emphasizing the distinction between ceremonial partnership and operational control. William's role became increasingly visible. He participated in planning sessions, traveled with Charles for key engagements, and appeared in photographs that highlighted the father-son collaboration. This public alignment reinforced the centralization of authority and signaled continuity of leadership to both palace staff and the wider public. The internal shift demonstrated the importance of vigilance, accountability, and loyalty to the institution above personal alliances. Charles had made a deliberate choice to prioritize the stability of the monarchy, balancing family relationships with the responsibilities of kingship. Camilla faced the long-term consequences of her actions. Attempts to assert authority or influence internally were met with procedural barriers and limited access. The palace hierarchy had clearly shifted, emphasizing accountability, transparency, and adherence to established protocols. This transformation preserved institutional integrity, while minimizing the risk of scandal or public unrest. While Charles and Camilla continued to interact publicly as expected, the personal dynamic had fundamentally changed. The marriage endured legally, but the partnership that once characterized their relationship no longer existed in practice. Charles channeled his energy into governance, family coordination, and maintaining the traditions of the crown, while Camilla adapted to a supportive, largely ceremonial role. The palace staff, observing these changes, adapted quickly and efficiently. The re-establishment of traditional protocols restored confidence among advisors and administrators who had previously been concerned about the gradual shifts in authority. Over time, the internal operations of Buckingham Palace stabilized, ensuring that institutional knowledge, traditional practices, and effective oversight were preserved. Charles' decisive action had long-lasting effects, reinforcing both his leadership and the principles upon which the monarchy functioned. Camilla learned to navigate her new reality with care, balancing her public duties with an understanding of her diminished internal influence. The royal family, the palace staff, and the monarchy itself moved forward under a new equilibrium, one in which loyalty, transparency, and institutional integrity took precedence over personal ambition. The consequences of William's intervention and Charles's decisive response were felt across multiple levels, shaping the operation of the palace, family dynamics, and the governance of the institution for the foreseeable future. In this way, Buckingham Palace adapted to a new reality, balancing appearances with internal control, ensuring stability, and maintaining the dignity and authority of the crown in the face of unprecedented challenges. The story of this transformation serves as a reminder of the delicate balance between personal relationships and institutional responsibility, and of the careful, sometimes painful decisions required to safeguard traditions, trust, and the long-term integrity of the monarchy. For Camilla, the months following the implementation of Charles' new protocols were a period of quiet struggle and gradual adaptation. Each morning began with a sense of tension she had never experienced before in her decades of palace life. Previously, she had been accustomed to being consulted, to having her voice heard in decisions affecting the household, the staff, and public engagements. She had moved through Buckingham Palace with a degree of influence that, while never absolute, had allowed her to shape events, to guide staff, and to participate meaningfully in the monarchy's work. Now, those familiar touchpoints had been systematically altered. Staff, who had once turned to her for guidance, now redirected inquiries to the king's office, a subtle but clear signal that her authority had been removed. Meetings she had previously attended were either shortened, restructured, or held entirely without her presence. Schedules that once revolved around shared responsibilities with Charles were now segmented, carefully orchestrated, so that her input was no longer necessary or expected. The Queen Consort attempted to maintain her composure, attending engagements, smiling for cameras, and participating in public appearances with the grace that had been expected of her for decades. However, behind the polished exterior, she experienced a profound sense of disconnection and isolation. Simple daily interactions with staff became fraught with tension. Loyal aides, unsure of how to navigate the new power dynamics, acted cautiously around her, providing only essential information and withholding informal insights or context. Camilla began to notice patterns she had not seen before. Certain corridors were avoided, some conversations seemed intentionally hushed, and even casual greetings carried a measured distance. She realized that the palace itself had changed, not in structure, but in the subtle social dynamics that governed her daily life. Attempting to regain clarity, Camilla meticulously reviewed past events, trying to identify the moment when her influence began to erode. She retraced conversations, private meetings, and decisions she had made over the preceding months, searching for errors or misjudgments that might explain the sudden shift. With each reflection, a mix of frustration, confusion, and sadness took hold. She understood intellectually that Charles' actions were designed to protect the institution, but personally, the experience was painful. The Queen Consort attempted to reach out to trusted friends within and outside the palace. She arranged private lunches with old confidants, hoping to gain perspective on her diminished role. Yet, even these conversations offered only partial insight. Friends were cautious, understanding that sharing opinions too candidly could have consequences, and Camilla was left piecing together fragments of information. She considered contacting William directly, believing that her relationship with him might provide a path to understanding. However, his busy schedule and the formal nature of his response reinforced the growing realization that her isolation was complete. Both in palace operations and within the family's inner circles, nights were the hardest. Camilla found herself lying awake, replaying events and conversations, imagining what she could have done differently, and questioning whether she had misjudged the intentions of those around her. Anxiety crept in as she recognized the fragility of her position. Her title and public appearances remained intact, but her real influence had been curtailed. Every decision, every policy, every meeting now had to navigate the new reality that Charles and William controlled access, authority, and the flow of information. Even small gestures of independence, suggesting a minor staffing change or proposing an idea for an event, were met with procedural obstacles, requiring approval from offices that were previously informal. Slowly, Camilla began to adapt. She learned to focus on areas where she could still contribute meaningfully, without overstepping the boundaries set by Charles. Charitable events, public engagements, and social responsibilities became the primary arenas where she exercised her agency, though always within the limitations now imposed. She developed new routines to occupy her time productively, dedicating herself to philanthropy and cultural projects where her contributions were visible but carefully defined. Psychologically, the process was a balancing act. Camilla had to maintain dignity, public composure, and personal resilience while processing the emotional toll of her exclusion. At the same time, she observed the careful coordination between Charles and William, recognizing the efficiency and clarity of authority that now governed palace operations. Slowly, she began to accept the fact that the power she had once held could not be reclaimed through confrontation or complaint. Instead, her influence could only persist in areas sanctioned by the king, with the understanding that any attempt to challenge the established order could result in further isolation or public embarrassment. This acceptance did not erase feelings of disappointment, regret, or frustration. Camilla reflected on her previous choices, considering whether her ambition, subtle maneuvering, or attempts to shape the palace environment had unintentionally triggered the response she now experienced. She realized that her desire to have a meaningful role in decision-making, while understandable, had collided with the necessity for clear oversight and the safeguarding of institutional integrity. In time, Camilla developed strategies to navigate the palace landscape quietly. She cultivated relationships within her permitted scope, maintained cordial interactions with staff, and focused on public-facing duties that allowed her to preserve dignity and relevance. Internally, she processed a profound personal lesson. Influence is not merely a matter of position or title. It is granted through trust, transparency, and alignment with institutional priorities. Meanwhile, Charles continued his duties with renewed efficiency. His focus on oversight, institutional protocols, and centralized decision-making stabilized the operations of the palace. William's role as a trusted intermediary and advisor reinforced the family's unity and purpose, even as internal dynamics had shifted dramatically. For Camilla, the new reality was challenging but survivable. Her experiences underscored the delicate balance between personal ambition, trust, and responsibility, offering a lasting perspective on power, influence, and the consequences of action within an institution as historically significant as the British monarchy. While public appearances suggested continuity, behind closed doors a profound transformation had taken place, one that redefined relationships, clarified authority, and reshaped the internal hierarchy of Buckingham Palace in a way that would endure for years to come. Through patience, reflection, and careful adaptation, Camilla learned to navigate this altered environment, maintaining her responsibilities and public role while understanding the limits imposed by the king and the institution she served. The experience was a testament to the complexities of personal relationships, the weight of trust, and the necessity of balancing ambition with respect for established structures and authority. In this environment, survival required humility, strategic awareness, and acceptance of the new order, a lesson Camilla would carry for the rest of her life, quietly managing her presence while adapting to her revised role within one of the most scrutinized and tradition-bound institutions in the world. Over time, the changes implemented by Charles fundamentally reshaped Buckingham Palace and the dynamics of the British monarchy in ways that would endure for decades. With Camilla's influence significantly curtailed, the king established a system of governance within the royal household that prioritized transparency, accountability, and clear chains of command. Every significant decision regarding staff appointments, budget allocations, or event planning now required the king's direct review and written authorization. Departments that had once exercised independent authority were reorganized under this centralized oversight, ensuring that institutional knowledge was preserved and that the risk of unilateral action was minimized. Charles' approach demonstrated a careful balance between maintaining tradition and asserting practical control. He understood that the monarchy's credibility relied not just on public appearances, but on the proper functioning of internal structures and adherence to established protocols. William, observing the situation closely, took an increasingly prominent role. He was no longer simply the heir apparent waiting in the wings. He became an active participant in the administration of palace affairs. His involvement in strategic meetings, planning sessions, and oversight of sensitive operations reinforced both the legitimacy of the changes and the continuity of governance. The father-son partnership became visible to staff and the public alike, symbolizing stability and reinforcing confidence in the monarchy's direction. For palace staff, the re-establishment of proper procedures brought relief and clarity. Long-serving advisors and administrators, many of whom had been quietly concerned about shifts in power dynamics, could now operate with renewed confidence. Responsibilities were clearly defined, and lines of authority were transparent. Employees who had previously been uncertain about the implications of informal directives now understood the expectations and knew exactly to whom they were accountable. This restoration of structure not only improved operational efficiency, but also reinforced loyalty to the Crown as an institution, rather than to any individual member.